She says she's fine, but her body says otherwise. Today, Linda wakes up exhausted, her arms and legs heavy, and for the first time, CEO Quang puts everything aside, work, calls, pressure, just to stay with her, cook for her, and quietly hold her through a difficult day. Hello everyone, hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we'll explore a gentle but deeply emotional moment in Linda and CEO Quang's journey. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss our next videos. Morning arrived quietly, the way it often did in their home, without alarms or urgency. Soft daylight filtered through the curtains and rested on the edge of the bed. Linda opened her eyes and stayed still, listening to the familiar sounds of the house breathing around her. Usually, she would stretch, swing her legs down, begin the small rituals of the day. This morning, she didn't. Her body felt heavy, not painfully so, but weighed down, as if the night had left something behind. When she tried to move her arms, a dull ache spread through her shoulders and down to her hands. Her legs felt distant, slow to respond. She sat up carefully, placing one hand on the mattress for balance. The room tilted for a moment, just enough to make her pause. Linda closed her eyes, inhaled slowly, and waited for the sensation to pass. It did, but the heaviness stayed. She told herself it was normal. Pregnancy came with days like this. Still, she remained seated longer than usual, her hair falling loose around her face, untouched. There was no energy to gather it, no urgency to look presentable. She simply sat, breathing, accepting the moment as it was. Quang noticed before she spoke. He had woken earlier, as he often did, and was standing by the doorway, watching her without making his presence obvious. Something about the way she held herself felt different. She looked smaller somehow, folded inward. He didn't rush to her or fill the silence with questions. He waited, trusting his instinct to observe first. When Linda finally stood and took a step toward the bathroom, her movement was slow, cautious. Halfway across the room, her fingers brushed the wall, steadying herself. "Hey," Quang said softly, already crossing the room. There was no alarm in his voice, just warmth. Linda smiled at him, a reflex she didn't question. "I'm okay," she said, though the words sounded thinner than she intended. Quang heard it immediately. He guided her back to the bed and helped her sit. This time, she didn't resist. He crouched in front of her, meeting her eyes at the same level. "How do you feel?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then shrugged. "Tired. Everything feels heavy today." He nodded, accepting her answer without trying to fix it with reassurance. "Then today can be slow," he said. "There's no rush." Quang reached for his phone, typed a brief message, and set it aside. Linda noticed but didn't ask. She didn't need to. He stayed with her, placing his hands lightly around her calves, warming them, grounding her. The contact was steady, unhurried. She let her shoulders relax, something she hadn't realized she was holding tight. The kitchen came alive quietly as Quang moved through it. No clattering, no sharp sounds, just the low flame of the stove, the gentle rhythm of preparation. Linda sat at the table wrapped in a cardigan, watching him from a distance. The smell of broth filled the room, simple and comforting. It reminded her of mornings from long ago, when care was shown not with words but with presence. She found herself breathing more evenly, her body responding to the calm he created. When he placed the bowl in front of her, Quang waited. "Is it too hot?" he asked. Linda took a small spoonful and shook her head. "It's good," she said quietly. They ate without rushing. Linda paused often, listening to her body. Quang followed her pace, never urging her to finish. When she set the spoon down, he didn't comment. He simply cleared the table and returned with a warm towel, placing it gently in her hands. "You don't have to do all this," Linda said, her voice low. She wasn't complaining. It was an observation mixed with something softer. Quang sat beside her, close enough that their arms touched. "I know," he replied. "I want to." The simplicity of his answer settled something inside her. She leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. For a moment, she allowed herself to be fully still, to not explain or justify her tiredness. "I don't like feeling this way," she admitted after a while. "Like my body isn't mine." Quang wrapped an arm around her, his hand resting over her forearm. "Your body is doing something important," he said. "It's allowed to ask for rest." Linda closed her eyes, letting his words sink in without argument. She didn't need encouragement to be strong. She needed permission to pause. Later, he helped her settle on the couch, arranging pillows until she nodded in approval. He knelt beside her and began to massage her hands, slow and careful. Linda watched his face as he focused, the way his attention narrowed to the small task. The sight stirred emotion she hadn't expected. Gratitude, yes, but also relief. She wasn't alone in this. She didn't have to carry everything silently. "Thank you," she whispered, the words heavier than they sounded. Quang looked up at her and smiled, a small, steady smile. "Rest," he said. She did. Her eyes closed naturally, her breathing deepened. Quang remained there, a book unopened in his lap, listening to the rhythm of her sleep. Outside, the day continued, busy and indifferent. Inside, the moment was held gently, without pressure or expectation. It wasn't perfect. It was real. And for now, it was enough. Linda woke to the soft click of a phone screen dimming. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then she felt the pillow under her cheek, the blanket across her legs, and the steady presence nearby. She opened her eyes and found Quang in the armchair beside the couch, his phone in one hand, untouched for a while. He wasn't scrolling. His gaze lifted as soon as she stirred. "Hey," he said, like he'd been waiting for that exact second. Linda blinked, her limbs still heavy, sleep only smoothing the edges. "How long was I out?" "Long enough," Quang replied. He stood and came closer. "Water." She nodded. He brought a glass from the kitchen and held it while she drank. His hand was steady, close without hovering. When she handed it back, she glanced toward the hallway. "I should use the bathroom." "I'll walk with you," he said. I know," he cut in gently. Still. They moved at her pace. Linda kept her fingers on his forearm as they crossed the room. It wasn't a rescue. It was a quiet anchor. At the bathroom door, she paused, embarrassed by how much she needed that small contact. Quang read her face. "No need to explain," he murmured. "Take your time. I'm here." While she was inside, she heard a kettle click on, a cabinet opening. When she came out, he was waiting with a warm mug. The steam smelled faintly of ginger and honey. "You remembered," she said, voice rough. "I remember what helps," he replied, then added softly, "especially today." Back on the couch, Linda settled again. Quang sat beside her, angled toward her but giving her space. He watched her hands around the mug, the way she flexed her fingers like they didn't quite belong to her. "Is it pain?" he asked, "or just exhaustion?" "Exhaustion," Linda said. "Like my arms and legs are full of sand." Quang nodded. "Any dizziness now?" "No, earlier. It passed." He tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was small, intimate, and it made her throat tighten. "Sometimes I get scared when I feel different," she admitted. "I don't know what's normal anymore." "Tell me when you're scared," Quang said. "Not after you've already carried it alone." Linda stared at the tea, avoiding his eyes. "I don't want to worry you." "You do," he said honestly. "But that's not a problem. That's me caring." The simplicity of it loosened something in her chest. She let out a long breath. "I feel useless on days like this." "You're not," Quang said, steady. "Your body is working hard. Rest isn't weakness." Linda's mouth trembled with a small, tired smile. "It doesn't feel like work. It feels like I'm disappearing." Quang went quiet. He looked down for a moment, then back at her, as if choosing words he could stand behind. "You're not disappearing," he said. "You're changing, and I'm here while you do." Linda studied him, noticing the tiredness in his eyes, the kind that comes from caring too much. "Did you cancel your day?" she asked. Quang didn't pretend. "Yes." "You shouldn't have." "I should," he replied. "If I can't be here on a day like this, then what am I doing with everything else?" Linda shifted, trying to get comfortable. Her legs ached in a way that made her want to rub them constantly. Quang noticed immediately. He stood and disappeared into the kitchen, returning with a basin of warm water and a towel. "For your feet," he said, setting it down carefully. Linda opened her mouth to protest, then stopped. Quang tested the water with his fingers first, then lifted her feet one at a time, guiding them in. His movements were deliberate, respectful, like he was handling something valuable without making a show of it. "You don't think this is silly?" she asked, quieter than she meant. Quang glanced up. "I think it's love," he said. "That's all." The word landed gently but firmly. Linda swallowed, her eyes stinging. She didn't let the tears fall. She didn't want to turn tenderness into spectacle. She just wanted to sit inside it. When he finished, he dried her feet and pulled the blanket back over her. Then he sat close, his arm along the back cushion. Linda leaned into him without thinking, her head resting against his shoulder. After a while, she spoke again. "What are you afraid of?" Quang exhaled slowly. "I'm afraid of missing something," he admitted. "A sign, a moment where you need help and you hide it because you're trying to be brave." Linda's throat tightened. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not," he said quickly, then steadied. "But I know you'll try to carry it anyway." She didn't deny it. Her silence was answer enough. Quang's voice dropped even lower. "I'm also afraid you'll look at me one day and feel alone, even if I'm standing right here." Linda's eyes filled quietly. She wiped them with the edge of the blanket. "I never wanted to shut you out," she whispered. "I'm not shut out," Quang said. "I just need you to let me in on the hard days, too." Linda nodded, small and sincere. "Okay." The room dimmed as afternoon slid toward evening. Quang's phone buzzed once from the counter. He didn't reach for it. He stood and went to the kitchen instead, the calm determination in his movements returning. "I'll make something small," he said. "You stay. No guilt." Linda listened to the gentle sounds, water running, a pan warming, the quiet clink of a spoon. It wasn't grand. It was steady. It made her feel safer than any promise. When he brought the food over, he sat with her. They ate slowly, sharing bites, letting the silence be comfortable. Quang talked about small things on purpose, an old movie they both liked, a funny story from work that didn't matter, the neighbor's dog barking at nothing. Ordinary words, offered like a blanket. After dinner, he helped her stand and guided her down the hallway. In the bedroom, he switched on a lamp instead of the overhead light. The soft glow made the room feel warmer. Linda sat on the bed, rubbing her hands together. "What if tomorrow is like this too?" she asked, voice thin. Quang stepped closer and knelt in front of her. "Then tomorrow is slow too." he said. "We adjust. We don't panic. We take care of you." Linda's eyes held his. She reached for his hand and placed it against her abdomen, guiding it gently. His palm rested there, warm and still. They both went quiet, listening to the shared silence. Linda leaned forward until her forehead touched his. "Thank you," she breathed. Quang closed his eyes. "Always," he murmured. He stayed there until her shoulders softened, until her breathing slowed, until the room felt quiet in the best possible way.
Xin chào mọi người. Trong tập này, Linda và bà Linda theo bà và cậu cháu ra nương mía. Dưới nắng sớm, bà vừa chặt mía vừa kể chuyện ngày xưa. Dậy chặt 3 hoặc 4 khúc cho đẹp để bán được giá. Đồng mía cao dần, 45 đồng trở thành hy vọng cho phiên chợ. Một cây mía đổ bất ngờ khiến cả nhóm kêu, rồi cười xòa vì kịp đỡ nhau. Chiều xuống, Linda buồn bã vì con rúi của mình đã biến mất. Nghi có kẻ trộm rình quanh nhà. CEO Quang ghé đến lắng nghe và trấn an và tự sửa chiếc camera cũ trong kho, kéo dây lắp trước sân nhà để bảo vệ cô. Đêm đến, Linda nấu cơm nếp cẩm mời anh ở lại ăn. Hai người trò chuyện lòng ấm lại. Quang kể áp lực công ty, camera nháy sáng, bóng lạ thoáng qua, và không biết Linda có sống sót qua được đêm nay không. Mọi người nếu thấy video hay, hãy cho mình một like, một subscribe. Cảm ơn mọi người nhé.